Hello and welcome to this video walkthrough series, Part 3, Documenting APIs, a guide for technical writers and engineers. In this video I just wanted to show you the workshop video recording section of the course. This is a great place to get started, maybe before you even start the course. You can go through and watch these 5 videos. There's also an audio-only version if you need to listen to it on the public transportation or while you're riding a bike or something like that. In each video is about an hour long, and I recommend watching them all in order. One good tip is to use the settings to go to playback speed and select a higher speed, whether that's 1.5 or all the way to 2 times the normal speed. I find that I'm able to pay attention longer and get through more if I go at a higher speed. And if you're really aggressive about video watching productivity, I recommend on Google Chrome in the Chrome store finding a reputable Chrome extension that speeds up videos further, which you can control with your keyboard, and that will allow you to play it at maybe 3 times speed or something like that. But for now I recommend speeding it up through YouTube's built-in settings menu and going to playback speed. So there's about 5 videos here. I recommend just going through one at a time, pretending you're an audience member, and go along if you want to with another thing here, the workshop activities. These workshop activities have all the directions that the people that when you're viewing the video you'll hear the instructor Tom talking to the people in the audience and giving them activities. He is using this source here in workshop activities. Click on a button to expand the activity details, and he will reference them as he talks in the videos, so you'll know which one to click on. And along with those activities, he gives a presentation throughout the videos, and those are linked to these course slides. They're little presentations you can go through to follow along and make it a real workshop experience. Pretend you're there. Alright, we'll head back to the website real quick. So you've got your course slides, your workshop activities. Oh, one thing I forgot to mention in the workshop activities, sometimes it's not in the video. And by the way, these workshop activities sometimes update because he regularly gives these workshops. He sometimes updates the material because the tools change, terminology changes, stuff like that. But what I was going to show you here at the conclusion, at the very end of the workshop activities, you have API Jeopardy, test your knowledge. And here you go one at a time. And here under number 1 it says an authorization method for API requests uses a third-party identity server such as Google, GitHub, or Facebook. So if you want to find the question that matches with that, you go to the answer key at the end of the Jeopardy. I'll open that in a new window, and you match number 1 to number 1. What is OAuth? So what I did is I actually went to both pages. I unclicked all the buttons. I grabbed the text, copied it into a Word document, and printed it out. I found it was a good way to kind of use as flashcards to improve your vocabulary around the whole API documentation space. So that is course slides, workshop activities, and video recordings. He has two sections here that talk about his personal reasons for creating the course, and also a bit of background around him. I won't go over those, but I invite you to go on the site and take a look. He talks about, here it says, why I developed this course and about the author. But to wrap up this video, I was going to go through this next section, the market for REST API documentation. All right. Before we dive into the technical aspects of APIs, let's explore the market, general landscape, and trends with API documentation. Diversity of APIs. The API landscape is diverse. In addition to web service APIs, which include REST, there are WebSocket APIs, hardware APIs, and more. Despite the wide variety, there are almost just two main types of APIs most technical writers interact with, and those are native library APIs, such as APIs for Java, C++, and .NET, REST APIs, which are a type of web API. With native library APIs, you deliver a library of classes or functions to developers, and they incorporate this library into their projects. They can then call those classes or functions directly in their code. With REST APIs, you don't deliver a library of files to users. Instead, the users make requests for the resources on a web server, and the server returns responses containing the information. REST APIs follow the same protocol as the web. When you open a browser and type a website URL, such as https I'dRatherBeWriting.com, you're actually making a GET request for a resource on a server. The server responds with the content, and the browser makes the content visible. This course focuses mostly on REST APIs because REST APIs are more popular and in demand, and because they're also more accessible to technical writers. You don't need to know programming to document REST APIs. And REST is becoming the most common type of API anyway. Even so, I also cover native library APIs briefly in a native library APIs section. Programmable Web API Survey rates doc #1 factor in APIs. Before we get into the nuts and bolts of documenting REST APIs, let me provide some context about the popularity of the REST API documentation market in general. In 2013, in a 2013 survey by ProgrammableWeb.com, which is a site that tracks and lists web APIs, about 250 developers were asked to rank the most important factors in an API. Complete and accurate documentation ranked as #1. And there's a chart below. And the caption reads, Programmable Web Survey showing that complete and accurate documentation is the most important factor for developers. John Musser, one of the founders of Programmable Web, emphasizes the importance of documentation in his presentations. In 10 Reasons Why Developers Hate Your API, he says the #1 reason developers hate your API is because your documentation sucks. If REST APIs were an uncommon software product, it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But actually, REST APIs are taking off in a huge way. Programmable Web charts and tracks the number of web APIs added to their directory. Programmable Web says, since January of 2014, an average of more than 2,000 APIs have been added per year. Research shows interest in providing APIs still high. And you can see a chart here for growth in web APIs since 2005. It just slowly skyrockets. eBay's API in 2005 was one of the first web APIs. The API allowed sellers to manage their products in their eBay stores. Since then, there has been tremendous growth in web APIs. Given the importance of clear and accurate API documentation, this presents a perfect market opportunity for technical writers. Technical writers can apply their communication skills to fill a gap in a market that is rapidly expanding. Because REST APIs are a style rather than a standard, docs are essential. REST APIs are a bit different from the SOAP APIs that were so popular some years ago. SOAP APIs, Service-Oriented Architecture Protocol, enforces a specific message format for sending requests and returning responses. As an XML message format, SOAP is very specific and has a WSDL, Web Service Description Language, file that describes how to interact with the API. REST APIs, however, do not follow a standard message format. Instead, REST is an architectural style, a set of recommended practices for submitting requests and returning responses. To understand the request and response format for REST APIs, you don't consult the SOAP message specification or look at the WSDL file. Instead, you have to consult the REST API's documentation. Each REST API functions a little bit differently. There isn't a single way of doing things, and this flexibility and variety fuel the need for accurate and clear documentation. I'll explain more about REST APIs in the What is a REST API section. As long as REST APIs vary from one another, there will be a strong need for technical writers to provide documentation. The web is becoming an interwoven mashup of APIs. Another reason why REST APIs are taking off is that the web itself is evolving into a conglomeration of APIs. Instead of massive do-it-all systems, websites are pulling in the services they need through APIs. For example, rather than building your own search to power your website, you might use Algolia instead and leverage their service through the Algolia Search API. Rather than building your own payment gateway, you might integrate the Stripe API. Rather than building your own login system, you might use the User App API. Rather than building your own e-commerce system, you might use the Snipcart API, and so on. Practically every service provides its information and tools through an API that you use. Jekyll, a popular static site generator, doesn't have all the components you need to run a site. There's no newsletter integration, analytics, search, commenting systems, forms, chat, e-commerce, surveys, or other systems. Instead, you leverage the service you need into your static Jekyll site. Cloud Canon has been put together a long list of services that you can integrate into your static site. And it shows a picture of a few, including Aweber, Campaign Monitor, MailChimp, MailerLite, and Syndicate. This cafeteria-style model is replacing the massive Swiss Army site model that tries to do anything and everything. It's better to rely on specialized companies to create powerful, robust tools, such as search, and leverage their service rather than trying to build all of these services yourself. The way each site leverages its service is usually through a REST API of some kind. Overall, the web is becoming an interwoven mashup of many different services and APIs interacting with each other. Job market is hot for API technical writers. Many employers are looking to hire technical writers who can create not only complete and accurate documentation, but who can also create stylish outputs for their documentation. Here's a job posting from a recruiter looking for someone who can emulate Dropbox's documentation. And then there's a screenshot here from Indeed.com that reads Contract API Tech Writer at Palo Alto. and then it highlights the client wants to find someone who will emulate Dropbox's developer documentation, and then they link to the documentation. As you can see, the client wants to find someone who will emulate Dropbox's documentation. Why does the look and feel of documentation matter so much? With API documentation, there is no GUI interface for users to browse. Instead, the documentation is the interface. Employers know this, so they want to make sure they have the right resources to make their API docs stand out as much as possible. Here's what the Dropbox API looks like. And then we've got a screenshot of Dropbox's API documentation, where it says read our docs, create your app, test your ideas, etc. It's not a sophisticated design, but its simplicity and brevity are what make it so appealing. When you consider the API documentation is more or less the product interface, building a sharp, modern-looking doc site is paramount for credibility and traction in the market. I dive into the job market for API documentation later. API doc is a new world for most tech writers. API documentation is often a new world for technical writers. Many of the components may differ from traditional GUI documentation. For example, all of these aspects with developer documentation differ from traditional documentation. Authoring tools, audience, programming languages, reference topics, user tasks. When you try to navigate the world of API documentation, you may be initially overwhelmed by the differences and intimidated by the tools and code. Additionally, the documentation content itself is often complex and requires familiarity with development concepts and processes. Realizing there was a need for more information, in 2014 I guest edited a special issue of Intercom dedicated to API documentation. This issue was a good start, but many technical writers asked for more training. The Silicon Valley STC chapter held a couple of workshops dedicated to APIs. Both workshops sold out quickly, with 60 participants in the first and 100 participants in the second. API documentation is particularly hot in the San Francisco Bay Area, where many companies have REST APIs requiring documentation. From these early days, I realized that API documentation would be a hot topic, so I turned my focus towards this area for the next few years, giving more presentations, workshops, and all the while building this comprehensive course. Overall, technical writers are hungry to learn more about APIs. This course will help you build the foundation of what you need to know to get a job in API documentation and excel in this field. As a skilled API technical writer, you will be in high demand and will fulfill a critical role in companies that distribute their services through APIs. And I'll stop there for part number 3. When we come back, we'll talk about what a REST API is and go through the activity of identifying your goals for the course. All right, thanks. See you in the next one.